The champagne flute exploded against marble like a gunshot in a cathedral. Crystal fragments caught the penthouse lights like fallen stars, and amber liquid splashed across Zara Washington's black uniform shoes. She didn't flinch. 6 months later, she'd own his empire. But right now, in this moment, Nathaniel Cross towered above her with those steel-gray eyes full of the kind of contempt that had become her daily soundtrack. "Clean it up," he commanded, not even looking at her face. "And next time, don't breathe so loudly when you're dusting. It's distracting. Don't breathe so loudly." 4 words that would haunt Manhattan's most feared billionaire for the rest of his life. 4 words that would cost him everything. 4 words spoken to a woman he saw as nothing more than furniture with a heartbeat. Here's what Nathaniel Cross didn't know about the woman kneeling among his broken glass. Zara Washington held a PhD in data analytics from MIT. She'd once managed million-dollar budgets for Fortune 500 companies, had presentations that made executives weep with their brilliance, had a mind that could solve problems others couldn't even see. But medical bills don't care about degrees. Her mother's cancer treatments had devoured every savings account, every retirement fund, every piece of the carefully built life she'd worked decades to create. The chemotherapy sessions cost $15,000 each. The experimental treatments her insurance wouldn't cover reached $50,000 a month. Her younger brother Damon's Columbia acceptance letter still hung on their refrigerator like a prayer. $80,000 a year in tuition that might as well have been $1 million. He'd earned full academic scholarships, but living expenses, books, lab fees, all those hidden costs that destroy dreams, still needed $30,000 a year. Zara had sold her car, her jewelry, her furniture. She'd moved from her Manhattan apartment to a studio in Queens. She'd applied for every job, every loan, every program. Nothing was enough. So when the agency called about a position paying $150,000 a year, she didn't ask questions. She should have. "The pay is exceptional," they'd said, and those words should have been her first warning. But Mr. Cross has very specific standards. Hey Soul Thread family, if you'd like to support the channel and help us keep creating these stories of hope, I've pinned a support link in the comments below. Thank you for being part of this journey. 2 hearts. What they didn't mention was that Nathaniel Cross collected broken people the way other men collected art. He found brilliant, desperate individuals and crushed them systematically, scientifically, until they fled his penthouse carrying pieces of their shattered dignity. 17 maids in 12 months. That was his track record. 17 women who'd walked through those gilded doors and stumbled out weeks, sometimes days, sometimes hours later. Some crying, some cursing, some so broken they couldn't speak at all. The agency kept detailed files on each failure. Sarah Martinez, former hotel manager, lasted 6 days before his criticism of her inefficient movements sent her to therapy. Dr. Rachel Kim, a former college professor supplementing her adjunct income, made it 11 days before his mockery of her academic softness broke her completely. Maria Santos, who'd run her own cleaning business for 15 years, lasted exactly 96 hours before his constant supervision drove her to a panic attack. Each woman had been chosen specifically, overqualified, desperate, proud. He enjoyed watching competence crumble under his impossible demands. The coffee had to be served at exactly 6:47 a.m., not 6:46, not 6:48. The temperature had to be precisely 185 degrees. The cup positioned 2 inches from the edge of his desk, handle pointing northeast. The newspapers arranged in perfect order. Wall Street Journal on top, folded to display only positive mentions of Cross Industries, followed by the Financial Times, then the New York Times business section. His shirts required a specific ironing pattern that took 45 minutes per garment. Collar first, then left sleeve, right sleeve, back panel, front panels. The creases had to align perfectly, not a millimeter off. The starch had to be imported from Switzerland, applied with a technique most people couldn't master in a lifetime. Every surface in his 8,000-square-foot penthouse required daily attention. The marble floors polished until they gleamed like mirrors. The crystal chandeliers cleaned individually, each of the 2,847 pieces dusted by hand. The windows, 47 of them, washed inside and out, streak-free, perfect enough to be invisible. But the most impossible demand of all was invisibility itself. Zara was expected to anticipate his needs without being seen, heard, or acknowledged. She was to move through his space like a ghost, completing tasks that took hours while remaining completely unnoticed. She was to be a shadow that cleaned, cooked, and organized, but never cast any darkness across his golden world. Most women broke within the first week. The combination of impossible standards and complete dehumanization created a special kind of torture that left even the strongest spirits shattered. But as Zara knelt among those crystal fragments, feeling the cold amber liquid seep through her uniform, watching this man who demanded she not even breathe in his presence, something shifted in her chest. Not resignation, not defeat, not the broken acceptance that had claimed 17 women before her. Something far more dangerous. Possibility. The possibility that a woman brilliant enough to earn a PhD from MIT, strategic enough to manage Fortune 500 budgets, strong enough to sacrifice everything for her family's survival, might just be smart enough to turn this impossible situation into the weapon that would bring down the most ruthless man in Manhattan. This isn't just about a maid and a billionaire. This is about every single one of us who's been underestimated, overlooked, or told we don't belong in spaces where our intelligence could change everything. This is about the moment when being invisible becomes the greatest advantage of all. Comment invisible if you've ever been treated like you don't exist while being the smartest person in the room. Hit that like button if you believe everyone deserves to be seen for who they really are, not what their circumstances force them to become. Because what Nathaniel Cross was about to learn is that the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone assumes doesn't matter. And Zara Washington was about to teach him that lesson in the most devastating way possible. The nightmare shattered the silence at 3:17 a.m. Zara was polishing the endless surfaces of his office, working late because the day's cruelties had put her behind schedule, when she heard it. Through walls thick enough to muffle Manhattan's chaos came a sound that made her freeze mid-motion, silver polish cloth suspended in her hand. Crying. Not just crying. Sobbing. Raw, broken sounds that seemed to tear through the carefully constructed facade of the untouchable billionaire. These weren't the controlled tears of frustration or anger she might have expected from a man like Nathaniel Cross. These were the sounds of a soul being ripped apart, over and over, night after night. The sounds stopped as suddenly as they'd started, leaving Zara standing in that pristine office, heart pounding, wondering if she'd imagined it all. But the silence that followed felt different, heavier, loaded with secrets that demanded answers. She found him the next morning slumped over his mahogany desk, still wearing yesterday's $5,000 suit, the fabric wrinkled beyond recognition. Empty whiskey bottles surrounded him like sentries, and scattered photographs lay across the polished wood surface like fallen leaves. Before he could wake and unleash his usual venom, Zara saw what those pictures contained. A woman with kind eyes and Nathaniel's smile, her hair caught in sunlight, holding a young boy who looked exactly like him. The child couldn't have been more than 7, gap-toothed grin stretching across his face as he clutched a baseball glove. Another photo showed all 3 of them at what looked like a school play, the woman's hand resting on Nathaniel's shoulder while the boy took a bow on stage. But it was the dates that made her heart stop. The last photo was dated 3 years ago, right around the time, she realized, when Nathaniel Cross had transformed from a demanding but functional businessman into the creature who now terrorized everyone around him. A car accident report was tucked beneath the photographs, official stamps and legal language marking the end of everything that had once made him human. The details were sparse but devastating. Black ice, an intersection, 2 lives lost instantly on a Tuesday morning in December. Family. The word hit her like revelation. This monster had once been a father. This cold, calculating billionaire had once been a husband who probably worried about soccer practice and parent-teacher conferences and whether his son was eating enough vegetables. "What are you staring at?" His voice cut through her thoughts like broken glass, hoarse from sleep and whiskey. Steel gray eyes fixed on her with familiar hostility, but now she could see something else lurking beneath the surface. Fear. Shame. The terror of being caught human. "Nothing, sir. Should I prepare your usual breakfast?" But everything had changed in that moment. As she moved through her morning routine, coffee at exactly 6:47, newspapers folded precisely, breakfast served without a word, Zara found herself studying him differently. The way his hands shook slightly when he thought no one was watching. The prescription bottles he tried to hide in desk drawers, labels turned away from prying eyes. Phone calls he never answered, letting them ring until the sound filled the apartment like an accusation. She began to notice patterns. How he flinched whenever children laughed in the park 47 floors below. How he changed the channel immediately if a commercial featured families. How he'd started drinking earlier and earlier each day, as if trying to drown something that refused to stay buried. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later, during one of the worst thunderstorms New York had seen in years. The power had flickered twice before finally dying completely, plunging the penthouse into darkness. Zara was preparing to leave. Her duties technically ended at 7, though she often worked later, when she heard the crash. Not the refined tinkle of expensive crystal meeting marble this time. This was the sound of furniture being overturned, of glass shattering against walls, of a man losing every last thread of control he'd been clinging to. She found him in his study, surrounded by chaos. Books pulled from shelves, chair overturned, family photos scattered across the floor with their frames broken. He was standing in the center of it all, chest heaving, knuckles bleeding from where he'd punched the wall. "Get out," he whispered, but there was no force behind it. The command that would normally send people fleeing carried all the strength of tissue paper in rain. The smart thing would have been to listen. The safe thing would have been to collect her things and run like 17 other women had done before her. Instead, Zara stepped into that destroyed room and knelt beside him. "Let me help." "I said get out." The words came out as a roar, but she didn't move. Something about the way he stood there, surrounded by the wreckage of his own making, reminded her of the way she'd felt kneeling among those champagne flute fragments. Broken, defeated, alone. "No," she said simply. The single word hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. In the darkness, with thunder shaking the windows and rain battering the glass, something fundamental shifted between the woman everyone underestimated and the man everyone feared. "She was supposed to be safe," he said finally, his voice barely audible above the storm. "I was supposed to protect them. I built all this, the money, the power, the reputation, to keep them safe. And I couldn't even manage that." Zara didn't ask who. She simply sat with him in that darkness, two broken people finding an unexpected moment of grace while Manhattan raged outside their windows. Type broken if you've ever hidden your pain behind anger because it felt safer than being vulnerable. This story is for everyone who's ever wondered what wounds create the monsters in our lives. Because sometimes the cruelest people are just the most frightened. And sometimes understanding doesn't excuse behavior, but it explains everything. After that storm-soaked night in his destroyed study, the rules changed in ways neither of them acknowledged aloud. Nathaniel still made his impossible demands. Coffee at exactly 6:47, shirts ironed to perfection, newspapers folded with surgical precision. But now Zara caught him watching her with something that wasn't quite hostility. When she brought his morning coffee, their fingers would brush for just a moment too long. When she worked late organizing his files, he would find reasons to stay in the same room, the silence between them charged with electricity neither dared name. 3 weeks passed this way. 3 weeks of stolen glances across marble floors, of conversations that started about household schedules and ended with both of them standing closer than necessary. 3 weeks of attention so thick it could be cut with a knife. "You're different from the others," he said one evening, appearing in the kitchen doorway where she was preparing his dinner. It was the first time he'd initiated conversation that wasn't a command, and his voice carried an uncertainty she'd never heard before. Zara looked up from the cutting board where she'd been dicing vegetables for his usual salmon dinner. "How so? You don't fear me?" The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. She set down her knife and turned to face him fully, meeting his gaze directly. The question she asked next would change both their worlds forever. "Should I?" Something flickered in his steel-gray eyes. Surprise, maybe recognition, perhaps the first glimpse of hope he'd felt in 3 years. "Most people do. Most people don't see you at 3 in the morning, crying in your sleep." The words hit their mark. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Zara thought he might fire her on the spot, might retreat behind those carefully constructed walls and pretend this conversation had never happened. Instead, he stepped into the kitchen. Close enough that she could smell his cologne, cedar and something expensive she couldn't identify. Close enough to see flecks of gold in those gray eyes that had terrorized 17 women before her. "What else do you see?" The question was barely a whisper, but it contained multitudes. Years of loneliness, months of pretending to be a monster, decades of building armor that had become a prison. Zara chose her next words carefully, knowing they would either build a bridge or burn one forever. "I see someone who's forgotten how to be human. Someone who built walls so high he can't remember what he's protecting himself from. And what if those walls are there for a reason?" She stepped closer, close enough to see the way his breath caught when she moved. "Then maybe it's time to find out if the reason still exists." When he reached out to touch her face, she didn't pull away. His thumb traced her cheekbone with the kind of gentleness she hadn't expected from hands that had thrown champagne flutes and destroyed furniture. She leaned into the touch like a flower turning towards sunlight after a long winter. "You're playing a dangerous game, Zara Washington." "So are you, Nathaniel Cross." The kiss, when it came, was inevitable and electric. 3 months of tension, of careful distance and stolen glances, of late nights in the same space pretending not to notice each other, exploded into something that felt like coming alive after years of merely surviving. His hands tangled in her hair, and she could feel the calluses on his palms, surprising roughness on a man who'd never worked with his hands. Her fingers clutched at his shirt, expensive fabric wrinkling under her touch, and for a moment the impossible distance between their worlds collapsed into nothing. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, the weight of what had just happened settled between them like a challenge. The kitchen felt different now, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. "This can't happen," he said, but his hands were still on her waist, thumbs tracing circles on her skin through the thin fabric of her uniform. "No," she agreed, even as she leaned into his touch, her body betraying every rational thought in her head. "It can't." But it did happen. Again and again. In stolen moments between his conference calls and her cleaning duties, they found each other. In the library where he taught her about wine and she taught him how to laugh again. In the garden where they talked until dawn about dreams they'd given up and disappointments they'd learned to carry. In quiet corners of his massive penthouse where the brilliant, educated woman and the broken billionaire discovered they weren't so different after all. 6 weeks. That's how long their impossible love affair lasted. 6 weeks of Zara living 2 lives. By day, the invisible maid who cleaned his messes and anticipated his needs. By night, the woman who held him when the nightmares came, who listened to stories about his son's first baseball game and his wife's terrible cooking. She learned that he'd once wanted to be a teacher before his father's business empire demanded an heir. That he still had his son's drawings tucked away in a safe, crayon masterpieces too precious to display but too painful to look at. That he'd built his reputation for ruthlessness as armor against a world that had taken everything he'd ever loved. He learned that her PhD thesis had been on predictive algorithms that could have revolutionized supply chain management, if anyone had been willing to listen to a young black woman's ideas. That she'd once been engaged to a man who'd left when her mother's diagnosis made their future too complicated. That she carried guilt about every sacrifice her family had made for her education, every dollar spent on her dreams while they scraped by. In those stolen hours, Nathaniel wasn't the monster who'd terrorized 17 women. He was just a man who'd forgotten how to be vulnerable, learning to trust again in the arms of a woman who saw through his cruelty to the broken heart beneath. And Zara wasn't the desperate maid cleaning up his messes. She was a brilliant woman whose temporary circumstances couldn't diminish her worth, falling for someone who finally saw her intelligence as the gift it had always been. But fairy tales don't survive in penthouses built on cruelty. And love affairs between maids and billionaires don't end with happily ever after. They both knew it couldn't last. Even as they whispered confessions in the darkness, even as they planned quiet moments together, even as they fell deeper into something that felt like salvation, they both knew the real world was waiting to destroy them. The question wasn't if their secret would be discovered. The question was who would destroy it first. Hit subscribe if you've ever fallen for someone you knew would break your heart. Comment dangerous if you've ever played with fire because the warmth was worth the burn. Because sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that were doomed from the start. The end came with laughter. Zara should have known something was wrong the moment she heard heels clicking across marble at 11 on a Tuesday morning. Nathaniel never had visitors during the day. His business meetings happened in sterile conference rooms downtown, away from the personal space where he'd learned to be human again. But Victoria Cross glided into his office like poison wrapped in Chanel, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. She was everything Zara wasn't. Born into wealth, raised on cruelty, educated in the art of destroying people with a whisper and making it look like kindness. Zara was dusting the crystal figurines on the mantelpiece when Victoria's voice filled the room, each word precisely calculated to wound. "So you're the latest pet," she said, looking Zara up and down with the kind of assessment usually reserved for livestock at auction. "I have to admit, Nathaniel, you've outdone yourself this time. A maid. Really?" The words hit like a slap, but Zara kept her expression neutral, continued moving her cloth across the delicate crystal. She'd learned to hide pain in this house, had perfected the art of becoming invisible when cruelty demanded an audience. "Victoria," Nathaniel's voice carried warning, but his sister ignored it the way she ignored everything that didn't serve her purposes. "Oh, don't worry. I'm not judging." Her laugh was like breaking crystal, beautiful and destructive. "We all have our diversions. God knows I've had my share of inappropriate attractions. But surely you don't expect this little fantasy to continue indefinitely." Ice formed in Zara's stomach, spreading through her chest like poison. She'd known this moment would come, had felt it approaching like a storm on the horizon, but knowing hadn't prepared her for the casual cruelty in Victoria's tone. "What are you talking about?" Nathaniel asked, but there was something in his voice that made Zara's world tilt on its axis. A distance that hadn't been there an hour ago when he'd kissed her goodbye in the kitchen. Victoria's smile widened, predatory and perfect. "The Pemberton merger. Darling. $3 billion. The biggest deal in Cross Industries history. You can't seriously think the board will approve if there are questions about your judgment. And sleeping with the help certainly raises questions about your decision-making abilities." She pulled out her phone, swiping through what looked like photographs. Interesting how quickly gossip travels in Manhattan social circles. "Someone saw you two through the garden windows last week. Very romantic. Very touching. Very stupid. The silence that followed was deafening. Zara watched Nathaniel's face in the reflection of the window she was now pretending to clean, saw the exact moment when the man she'd fallen in love with disappeared behind the mask of the ruthless businessman. His shoulders straightened. His jaw hardened. The warmth that had crept back into his eyes over the past 6 weeks vanished like it had never existed. "You're right," he said finally, not looking at Zara. Those 3 words landed like bullets, each one finding its mark with devastating precision. It was a mistake. The crystal figurine slipped from Zara's suddenly numb fingers, shattering against the marble floor in an explosion of glittering fragments. Neither sibling looked toward the sound. "I knew you'd see reason," Victoria continued, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "The Pemberton deal will make you the most powerful man on the eastern seaboard. You can't let some temporary infatuation jeopardize everything Father built." "What about her?" Nathaniel asked, and for a moment, just a moment, Zara heard something that might have been regret. Victoria already had a check prepared, pulled from her designer purse with the efficiency of someone who'd destroyed lives before. She held it up, and even from across the room, Zara could see the number that made her vision blur. $500,000. More money than her family had ever dreamed of. Enough to pay her mother's medical bills for years, to send Damon to Colombia without a second thought, to buy back every piece of dignity she'd sacrificed for this job. "Consider it severance pay," Victoria said sweetly, extending the check toward Zara like a peace offering wrapped in barbed wire. "Nathaniel is nothing if not generous with his discarded toys." The words hung in the air like acid rain, burning everything they touched. Zara looked at the check, then at the woman who wielded cruelty like a scalpel, then at the man she'd thought she knew. Nathaniel stood behind his desk like a statue, every line of his body rigid with the effort of maintaining his mask. He wouldn't meet her eyes, wouldn't acknowledge the 6 weeks of whispered confessions and stolen kisses and 2 broken people learning to trust again. In that instant, Zara understood something that would change everything. This wasn't about protecting a business deal. This wasn't about maintaining appearances or satisfying board members. This was about power. This was about a woman who couldn't bear to see her brother find happiness outside the empire she'd helped him build. This was about the kind of casual cruelty that came from never having to face consequences, never having to consider that the people you destroyed were actually human beings with hearts that could break. And Nathaniel, the man who'd cried in her arms about his dead family, who'd shared his deepest fears and oldest wounds, was choosing to be complicit in that cruelty rather than fight for something real. "Thank you," Zara said calmly, walking across the room to take the check from Victoria's perfectly manicured fingers. "For everything." Her voice didn't shake. Her hands didn't tremble. She folded the check once, twice, and slipped it into the pocket of her uniform with the same precision she'd once used to arrange his newspapers. "You're welcome, dear," Victoria replied, her smile never wavering. "I'm sure you understand that this is for the best. People need to stay in their proper places, don't you think?" Zara looked at her for a long moment, memorizing every detail of that perfectly composed face, that confident smile, those cold eyes that saw other people as obstacles to be removed rather than lives to be respected. "Yes," she said quietly. "I think everyone should know exactly where they belong." She walked out of that penthouse with her head high and her heart in pieces, but also with something else burning in her chest. Something Victoria Cross had just ignited without realizing it. Something that would consume them both. In the elevator, descending through 47 floors of Manhattan luxury toward the street where real people lived real lives, Zara Washington began to plan. Not revenge. Revenge was hot and messy and emotional. This would be something far more devastating. This would be justice. Type betrayed if someone you loved ever chose money over you. Share this story if you believe everyone who's been discarded like trash deserves their moment of reckoning. Because the woman walking out of that building wasn't the same person who'd walked in 6 months earlier. And the Cross family was about to learn exactly what happened when you underestimated someone with nothing left to lose. Zara Washington had always been underestimated. Now she was going to turn that into the deadliest weapon Manhattan had ever seen. While Nathaniel and Victoria assumed she'd disappear into whatever shadows people like her were supposed to inhabit, maybe move back to her mother's apartment in Queens, maybe find another cleaning job, maybe just fade away like the 17 women before her, Zara was doing something they'd never expect. She was learning to fight back. The first step was education, but not the kind they'd recognize. Victoria's blood money, that $500,000 severance payment meant to buy her silence, became tuition for the most expensive education Zara had ever received. Night classes at Columbia in business law, corporate finance, forensic accounting. She studied the language of power, the networks that kept families like the Crosses untouchable, the legal loopholes that allowed billionaires to destroy lives without consequences. She absorbed every lesson like her life depended on it. Because it did. During the day, she worked temp jobs to pay for her mother's continued treatments. At night, she haunted libraries and coffee shops, teaching herself the intricate dance of corporate warfare. She learned how hostile takeovers really worked, how shell companies could hide money trails, how public relations campaigns could destroy reputations in a matter of hours. But Zara's real education came from the streets, from the casualties of the Cross Empire who'd been scattered across the city like wounded soldiers. Marcus Chen, the security guard fired 2 weeks after her departure for budget cuts, was happy to share what he knew over coffee in a 24-hour diner in Queens. Turns out, his firing had nothing to do with money and everything to do with what he'd witnessed during those late-night hours when Nathaniel thought no one was watching. "Security cameras see everything," he told her, sliding a flash drive across the sticky table. Everything. The previous maids were easier to find than she'd expected. 17 women scattered across the 5 boroughs, each carrying their own story of humiliation and dismissal, each one eager to speak to someone who finally understood their experience. Sarah Martinez, the former hotel manager who'd lasted 6 days, had kept detailed notes about Nathaniel's business calls, the ones he'd taken in front of her because he'd assumed she was too stupid to understand what offshore accounts and tax shelters meant. Dr. Rachel Kim, the college professor who'd made it 11 days, had a PhD in psychology and a perfect memory for the private conversations she'd overheard between Nathaniel and his business partners. Conversations about bribing city officials, about cutting corners on construction projects, about silencing inconvenient investigations with well-placed donations. Even some of Nathaniel's business associates, tired of his increasingly erratic behavior and ruthless tactics, were willing to listen to someone who promised a different kind of justice. Men who'd been pushed out of deals, partners who'd been cheated out of profits, competitors who'd been crushed by tactics that sailed dangerously close to illegal. Zara didn't just collect their stories. She corroborated them, cross-referenced them, built timelines and paper trails that connected dozens of apparently separate incidents into a pattern of systematic corruption. "You know what your problem used to be?" Marcus said one night, 3 months into her investigation. They were sitting in that same Queens diner, surrounded by the detritus of her research, bank statements, court filings, newspaper clippings that painted a picture of an empire built on other people's suffering. "What do you mean? You used to think like prey." He leaned forward, his eyes serious in the fluorescent light. "Prey hides. Prey runs. Prey hopes the predator will forget about them and move on to easier targets." Zara looked down at the evidence files that now filled 3 storage boxes in her apartment, at the corruption she'd uncovered that went back years before she'd ever set foot in that penthouse. "And now you think like a hunter." The real breakthrough came from the most unexpected source of all, Victoria Cross herself. The perfect sister, the untouchable socialite, the woman who'd orchestrated Zara's destruction with surgical precision, had her own secrets, her own vulnerabilities. Her own very expensive mistakes that she'd been hiding from her brother for years. A gambling addiction that had cost the Cross Family Foundation millions in misallocated funds. Art purchases that existed only on paper while the money vanished into offshore accounts. Embezzlement disguised as administrative fees, charity donations that never reached their intended recipients, tax fraud masquerading as creative accounting. Victoria had been stealing from her own family for 5 years, using her position as Nathaniel's trusted advisor to cover her tracks. The perfect sister was a fraud, and she'd left a paper trail that a forensic accountant with Zara's training could follow like breadcrumbs through a forest of corruption. It took 18 months to build her case. 18 months of meticulous work that required the same attention to detail she'd once used to arrange Nathaniel's newspapers and fold his shirts to impossible perfection. The irony wasn't lost on her. All those months of learning his impossible standards had taught her exactly the kind of precision she'd need to destroy him. 18 months of late nights and early mornings, of building relationships with people who'd been discarded by the Cross machine, of learning to speak the language of power fluently enough to turn it against itself. 18 months of remembering every cruel word, every moment of humiliation, every casual dismissal of her humanity. Not for fuel, she was far too strategic for mere anger now, but for focus. Because on a cold Tuesday morning in March, exactly 2 years after she'd first walked into that penthouse, Zara Washington opened her laptop in her small Queens apartment and began typing the first draft of the most devastating expose Manhattan's financial district had ever seen. She'd learned to think like them. Now she was going to destroy them using their own rules. The Cross family's annual charity gala was 3 weeks away. 500 of Manhattan's most powerful people gathered in one room to congratulate themselves on their philanthropy while the cameras rolled and the society pages took notes. It would be the perfect stage for the final act of this impossible transformation. Comment underdog if you've ever been counted out by people who didn't know your true power. Hit subscribe if you believe the best revenge is proving everyone wrong. Because Zara Washington was no longer the woman who'd cleaned up broken champagne flutes. She was something far more dangerous, a predator who'd learned to hunt in the shadows, patient enough to wait for the perfect moment to strike. And that moment was coming. The annual Cross Industries Charity Gala was Manhattan's social event of the year. A glittering spectacle where the city's elite congratulated themselves on their generosity while raising millions for causes they'd never personally encounter. 2 years ago, Zara had served at this event, invisible in her black uniform, watching the powerful play their games from behind silver serving trays and forced smiles. Tonight, she walked through the front door as an invited guest. The transformation was complete. Gone was the quiet maid who'd once cleaned broken champagne flutes. In her place stood a woman who commanded attention without asking for it, elegant in midnight blue silk that hugged her form like liquid starlight, confident in a way that made conversations pause and heads turn. She was terrifying in the most beautiful way possible. The ballroom hadn't changed much. Same crystal chandeliers casting rainbow light across marble floors she'd once polished. Same golden walls that had witnessed her humiliation. Same stage where Manhattan's most powerful people gathered to celebrate themselves. But everything else was different. Because this time, Zara Washington belonged here. Nathaniel saw her first. Across the crowded ballroom, through clusters of jeweled socialites and tuxedoed billionaires, their eyes met with the force of a collision. She watched the color drain from his face like life leaving a body, watched his champagne glass tremble in his suddenly unsteady hand. He looked older, she noticed with detached interest. Harder. The past 2 years had carved new lines around his eyes, had turned his steel-gray gaze brittle with something that might have been fear. Zara! His voice barely carried over the orchestra's waltz, but she heard the shake in it, the disbelief wrapped in dread. Hello, Nathaniel. Her smile was warm and terrible, like sunrise over a battlefield. You look surprised to see me. What are you doing here? I was invited. She gestured to the distinguished man beside her, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, radiating the kind of confidence that came from owning half of Manhattan's skyline. David and I have become quite close. He's been very interested in my insights about Cross Industries. David Pemberton, the billionaire whose merger had once been so important it was worth destroying love for. The man whose $3 billion deal had been the excuse Victoria used to tear apart 6 weeks of impossible happiness. The irony was exquisite. The blood drained from Nathaniel's face as understanding hit him like a physical blow. His eyes darted between Zara and David, calculations running behind his gaze as he tried to process what this meant for his empire. "David," he managed, extending his hand with practiced business charm that fooled no one. "I didn't know you were bringing a guest. Ms. Washington has been invaluable in helping me understand certain complexities in your business practices," David replied smoothly. "Her insights have been quite illuminating." That's when Victoria appeared, cutting through the crowd like a shark sensing blood in the water. She was resplendent in diamonds that caught the light like fallen stars, her blonde hair perfectly arranged, her smile sharp enough to cut crystal. But there was something frantic in her movements, something desperate in the way she grabbed Zara's arm with manicured fingers that felt like claws. "You little..." Victoria's voice was loud enough to draw attention from nearby guests, smartphones already appearing like fireflies in the darkness, society reporters leaning in with the predatory instincts of their profession. "Careful, Victoria," Zara said softly, not moving to free herself from that desperate grip. "You're making a scene. How dare you show your face here?" Victoria's mask was slipping, revealing the panic beneath the perfect socialite facade. "How dare you come to our event after what you tried to do to this family?" The words echoed across the ballroom, causing conversations to halt and eyes to turn their way. This was exactly what Zara had been counting on. "After what I tried to do." Zara's voice carried clearly in the sudden silence, each word precisely enunciated for maximum effect. "Victoria, I haven't done anything yet." She reached into her evening clutch, the same midnight blue as her dress, and withdrew a manila envelope that seemed to pulse with dangerous energy. "I'll destroy you," Victoria snarled, her grip tightening on Zara's arm hard enough to leave bruises. "I'll make sure you never work in this city again. You already tried." Zara's interruption was soft but carried the weight of absolute certainty. 2 years ago, you handed me a check and told me to disappear. You called me a discarded toy. You made sure I understood exactly where people like me belong in your world. The envelope passed from Zara's hands to Sarah Mitchell, Manhattan's most feared investigative journalist, whose column could make or break reputations with a single headline. "But you made one crucial mistake," Zara continued, her voice now carrying to every corner of the ballroom where Manhattan's elite stood frozen like figures in a twisted fairy tale. "You assumed I was powerless because I was poor. You assumed I was stupid because I was a maid. You assumed I would disappear because people like me always do." Sarah was already scanning the documents, her eyes widening as she absorbed financial records that painted a picture of systematic fraud. Evidence of bribes to city officials. Proof of charity funds diverted to offshore accounts. Recorded conversations that would end careers and launch investigations. "That envelope contains everything," Zara announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 2 years building an unshakable case. "Every illegal deal, every bribe, every life you've destroyed to build your empire. 5 years of corruption documented with a kind of precision you taught me to use when I folded your shirts." Victoria's face had gone ashen, her grip on Zara's arm loosening as the magnitude of her exposure began to register. Around them, the cream of Manhattan society watched with the horrified fascination of witnesses to an execution. "But more than that," Zara said, turning to face Nathaniel directly, "it contains stories. Dozens of them, from employees you discarded, competitors you crushed, anyone who dared stand in the Cross family's way. including 17 women who came before me, each one broken by the same systematic cruelty you perfected. She stepped closer to the man who'd once demanded she not breathe too loudly, the man who'd whispered confessions in her arms before choosing money over love. You see, you taught me how power works in your world. You showed me exactly how the game is played, how people like you stay untouchable while people like me stay invisible. Her smile was radiant and devastating, the expression of someone who'd learned to weaponize her own underestimation. Now I'm going to use that knowledge to tear your world apart. The silence that followed was deafening. Then the cameras started flashing, phones began recording, and the carefully orchestrated world of Manhattan's elite exploded into chaos as journalists surged forward and the Cross Empire began its very public collapse. Type justice if you've been waiting for this moment. Share this story if you believe everyone who's been underestimated deserves their moment of triumph. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone forgot was listening. And Zara Washington had been listening for 2 years, learning their language, studying their weaknesses, preparing for this exact moment when their arrogance would finally destroy them. The Maid had become the master, and the reckoning was just beginning. The fall of Cross Industries was swift and spectacular, like watching a skyscraper crumble in slow motion while the entire city held its breath. Within 72 hours of that charity gala revelation, federal investigators had seized every Cross Industries computer, frozen every account, and turned Nathaniel's pristine penthouse into a crime scene wrapped in yellow tape. The evidence Zara had spent 2 years meticulously collecting became the foundation for the largest white-collar criminal case Manhattan had seen in decades. Victoria was arrested on 18 counts of embezzlement and fraud, led away from her Park Avenue apartment in handcuffs while news cameras captured every moment of her public humiliation. The woman who'd once dismissed Zara as a discarded toy now faced 25 years in federal prison. Stock prices collapsed overnight. The Pemberton merger, the $3 billion deal that had once been worth more than love, was canceled before the ink could dry. Business partners fled like rats from a sinking ship, each one eager to distance themselves from the toxic Cross name. But for Zara, watching their empire burn wasn't where the real victory lived. The real victory was what she built from those ashes. The Cross Foundation, once a glorified tax shelter for the family's wealth, was restructured under new leadership. Her leadership. The board of directors, intimidated businessmen who'd once rubber-stamped Victoria's embezzlement, found themselves replaced by advocates, social workers, and people who actually understood what it meant to need help. Money that had once funded Victoria's gambling addiction at Monte Carlo casinos now paid for scholarships that sent brilliant kids from Queens to Ivy League universities. Funds that had once purchased meaningless art for tax write-offs now covered medical bills for families drowning in healthcare debt. Resources that had once maintained the Cross family's lifestyle of casual cruelty now provided second chances for people society had written off as disposable. Her mother's cancer treatment was fully funded. Not just the basic care that insurance grudgingly covered, but the experimental therapies that might actually save her life. The woman who'd raised Zara to believe in education and dignity finally had access to the best medical care money could buy. Damon graduated Columbia with honors and a job offer from a non-profit dedicated to educational equity. The boy whose acceptance letter had once hung like a prayer on their refrigerator now had a future as bright as his potential. The 17 women who'd come before Zara, the casualties of Nathaniel's systematic cruelty, found themselves with new opportunities. Sarah Martinez, the former hotel manager, was hired to run a hospitality training program for domestic workers. Dr. Rachel Kim returned to academia with a generous grant to study workplace psychology. Maria Santos started her own cleaning service, built on the radical concept of treating employees like human beings. Each woman got something Zara understood was more valuable than money: the chance to rebuild their dignity on their own terms. And Nathaniel, his story took a different turn than anyone expected. She found him 6 months after the arrests, living in a cramped studio apartment in Queens, the same neighborhood where she'd grown up. The address had taken 3 phone calls and a private investigator to find. The untouchable billionaire had become as invisible as she'd once been. When he opened the door, she barely recognized him. Gone was the imperious man who'd once demanded she not breathe too loudly. In his place stood someone hollowed out by consequences, wearing a Yankees t-shirt and jeans that had clearly come from Target, not some Madison Avenue boutique. "I suppose you've come to gloat," he said, his voice lacking any of its former command. "No," she said simply, stepping into his tiny kitchen with its mismatched furniture and chipped counters. "I've come to forgive you." They sat at his small table, drinking coffee from mugs that didn't match, and for the first time in their entire relationship, they were equals. No power dynamic. No employer and employee. Just 2 people who'd learned hard truths about love and betrayal and the price of choosing wrong. "I loved you," he said finally, the words emerging like a confession he'd been carrying for months. "I know you don't believe that after what I did, but I loved you more than I'd loved anyone since Emma and Jake died." Emma, Jake, his wife and son, whose photographs had once been scattered across his desk in drunken grief. This was the first time he'd spoken their names in her presence. "I know," she replied, and the words came easier than she'd expected. "That's what made it hurt so much. If you'd just been cruel, I could have dismissed you as a monster. But you let me see your humanity, and then you chose money anyway. Can you ever forgive me?" Zara considered the question, thinking of all the pain and anger she'd carried, all the nights spent planning his destruction, all the moments when hatred had felt like the only thing keeping her warm. "I already have," she said, surprising them both. "Forgiveness isn't about you, Nathaniel. It's about me choosing not to carry poison anymore." His eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide. "And us. Is there any possibility that we could?" "No." The word was gentle but final, delivered without cruelty but with absolute certainty. "Too much has happened. We're different people now, and some bridges burned so completely that they can't be rebuilt." He nodded, accepting what they both knew was true. Some choices create consequences that last forever, no matter how sincere the regret that follows. "What will you do now?" he asked. Zara smiled, thinking of the foundation, of the scholarship recipients who sent her thank you letters, of the lives she was helping to change simply by believing that everyone deserved a chance to be seen. "I'm going to keep doing the impossible," she said. "It turns out I'm quite good at it." 2 years later, Zara Washington stood in the ballroom of the same hotel where the Cross Industries Gala had once been held. But this time, she was the host, raising money for domestic workers' rights, providing legal aid for employees facing discrimination, turning the invisible visible in a city that profited from pretending they didn't exist. The irony was perfect. The same space where she'd once served champagne to people who looked through her now hosted events where those same invisible people were the guests of honor. "Ms. Washington?" A young woman approached during the cocktail hour, nervous hope written across her features. "I'm Maria Santos, not the Maria who used to work for Mr. Cross, a different Maria. I work for the Henderson family on the Upper East Side, and I heard about your foundation." Zara listened to Maria's story, familiar themes of impossible demands, casual cruelty, the grinding weight of powerlessness that came from needing a job more than dignity, and felt the old fire kindle in her chest. Not the destructive flame of revenge that had once sustained her, but something warmer, more sustainable, the desire to change the world one person at a time. "Tell me everything," she said, taking Maria's trembling hands in her steady ones. "And then let's figure out how to make the impossible possible." As Maria shared her experience, late-night demands, unpaid overtime, threats of immigration consequences that kept her silent, Zara saw herself 2 years ago. Desperate, brilliant, underestimated, ready to transform the world if someone would just give her the tools. Outside, Manhattan glittered with its usual indifference, A city of dreams and nightmares where power and powerlessness danced their eternal dance. Skyscrapers reached toward heaven while people struggled to survive at street level, the same contrast that had always defined this impossible place. But in that ballroom, surrounded by people who'd been invisible for too long, Zara Washington had done something truly revolutionary. She'd proven that in a world built on the assumption that some people don't matter, the most radical act of all is simply refusing to disappear. The black maid who'd taken the job no one wanted had indeed done the impossible. She'd transformed not just herself, but the very definition of what it meant to win. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all. Hey Soul Thread family, if you'd like to support the channel and help us keep creating these stories of hope, I've pinned a support link in the comments below. Thank you for being part of this journey. If Zara's story reminded you that no one can make you disappear unless you let them, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments. What impossible thing are you ready to make possible? Your story matters too, and I want to hear it. Every subscribe, every like, every share helps us reach someone who needs to remember their power. You are not invisible. You are not forgotten. You are not alone. Because sometimes the most important stories aren't about the fall of empires or the rise of the powerful. Sometimes they're about ordinary people who refuse to stay ordinary, who look at impossible circumstances and decide to make them possible anyway. Zara Washington started as a maid. She ended as a force of nature. And somewhere between cleaning up broken champagne flutes and rebuilding broken systems, she proved that the most dangerous thing you can do to someone with nothing left to lose is underestimate them. The impossible is just another word for something that hasn't happened yet. What impossible thing will you make possible today?